What's up, everybody? So we're gonna start this off without our silly video in the beginning tonight.
Big
Luckily
L.
Steve hasn't luckily Steve hasn't seen too much of our content, so he doesn't know how ridiculous we get sometimes. But a couple weeks ago, Rob and I both were talking about doing some things more on like church history based and getting into some, things that aren't current topics, because I think everybody's pretty much fed up with the drama in the church and stuff. So Rob read Steve's book. Steve, how do you pronounce your last name?
It's Weidenkopf.
Weidenkopf. The P is silent. Okay. Yeah. So Rob had read your book on the Crusades and he sent it to me and he said, hey, why don't we read this? And we were going to do like a short video, like 10 myths about the Crusades and kind of make it really well produced. And I said, why don't we get Steve on, talk to him first, and we'll maybe get a good interview in, and then maybe use his book to make one of those videos like that. Before we do that, Rob and I just put together something awesome in the merch store. We got bumper stickers and t-shirts for our Rob. Why don't you bring up the latest one we picked? So we were goofing on the Protestant phrase, have you accepted Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior? And we made, have you accepted Mary as your personal mother and intercessor bumper stickers.
Nice.
So if you guys want, they're pretty reasonable. So if you guys want to help support the show, these are probably a good conversation starter, and I'm sure everybody at your parish will want one of those as well when they see it on your car. So all right, let's back up now. Steve, writing a book on the Crusades, what kind of research are you able to do? Like, are you going through papal documents? Are there actual historians that wrote about the Crusades? Like, what's the research process like?
Yeah, good question. And let me just start off by saying that I'm tickled pink, actually, that you guys asked me to be on your show, because this actually is the 10th anniversary of that book's publication.
Is it?
Really?
Sweet.
Yeah, this summer, not today specifically, but this summer, 10 years ago, the book came out. So it's really, it makes me very happy and glad that people are still desiring to talk about this book 10 years after I wrote it. So thank you for having me on the show to be able to talk about it. But yeah, so a book like this, I mean, it's a bunch of different ways you approach the compilation of sources and researching for it. It's primary sources, secondary sources are available. So I used some, primary sources in translation. So you have some contemporaries who went on the Crusades, who actually recorded chronicles of the Crusades,
right?
Wow. From their perspective. So people like Fulcher of Chartres and others wrote about the Crusades that they participated in. So you can read their documents in translation or the original Latin if your Latin is good enough. And then, I looked at a series of secondary authors in particular from a wide range of disciplines and a wide range of interpretations of the Crusades. So actually the crusading movement and crusading history, I guess, has really become a specialization in the academic field of history in the last 40, 50 years or so. Prior to that, anybody who wrote on the Crusades was probably just your general run-of-the-mill medievalist as an academic, but now there is kind of a movement, or there has been more towards a specialization in Crusade studies. So you have some big name people that I read their works on, Jonathan Riley Smith, for example, who's kind of the godfather of modern day Crusade history studies. If you will, he passed away sadly a couple of years ago, but great British Catholic historian, great man. You have Thomas Madden is another individual who teaches at St. Louis University here in the States, who's written a few books on the Crusades, popular as well as academic. Others, John France, Christopher Tierman, a whole slew of them. So I gathered all of their books that they had written both, many years ago and recent, gathered primary sources, and tried to look at the topic from a multitude of different perspectives. And then my own personal process is to read those works and then take notes through the books as I'm reading them. And then I go back and type those notes up. And then from those notes, I create an outline. And from the outline, I then write. So that's how it kind of works. It's a long process, but that's how it works.
Were you able to get into the mindset of the common Crusader who ends up going, because what year is the First Crusade actually? What year are we talking?
Yeah, so Pope Urban II calls the First Crusade in November of 1095. So the first armies don't kind of leave until the next year in 1096, and then combat operations really begin in the summer and fall of 1096, 1097, all the way up until the summer of 1099, when the Holy City of Jerusalem is actually liberated. So you're looking at, late 11th century.
So this is right after the Great Schism.
Yeah, but about 50 years or so, right after the Great Schism between East and West. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And the Western Church is actually going to aid the Eastern Church in the First Crusade, correct?
Yeah, I mean, to an extent. I mean, I wouldn't say Western Church helping Eastern Church. I would say Western Christians helping Eastern Christians. It was not necessarily an ecclesial movement from that perspective. It's not like the Patriarch of Constantinople wrote a letter to the Pope and said, "Hey, come help us." It was actually the Byzantine Emperor who sent representatives to the West asking the Pope to marshal Western knights to come to the East to help them in the fight against, specifically the subject Turks at the time. Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. Okay. So we hear the common myth that all wars, religion is the cause of all wars. I mean, this is the narrative that they started putting forward. I'm guessing after the Reformation, but I think it really starts sinking into people's heads after World War II for some reason. And it seems like every conversation I ever had in school growing up was that religion is the cause of every strife we've had in human history. And this doesn't seem, they try to portray the Crusades. They always pick the most controversial one to discuss and talk about how the Christians were such awful people, but they don't really ever get into what would have happened if these Crusades had never taken place.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's modern day understanding and discussion of the Crusades usually focuses on the exception as the rule rather than looking at the rule, if you will. That's how I like to explain it, right? So instead of looking at just the average ordinary Crusader and what his experience was, or her, because there were women Crusaders, what their experience was and how they acted on Crusade, it's usually the small group of extremists or people who did horrible things, which did happen on the Crusade, and those instances and those people are the ones that are brought forward by modern day apologists against the church and against religion, the Catholic Church in particular and religion in general, and highlight that and say this is what the Crusades were all about, when it really was, in those instances, a particular situation, a particular individual, and is blown up to be, this is what the whole movement was. And it's just not a realistic picture, right, of who these people were and what they actually did accomplish, which was quite significant. And the whole concept of, religion, causes all these wars. I mean, there was a study that was done several years ago now, maybe 20 plus years ago now, 25 even now, years ago, where some historians actually looked at all the known recorded, wars and battles in human history. And I'm paraphrasing here, so I'm not getting the data exactly right, because I don't have it in front of me. But it was something like literally less than 10% of all wars in human history were from a religious perspective. And if you exclude those that were Islamic in nature of those religious wars, the percentage even goes significantly further down. Right. So wars are fought for all kinds of different reasons. Religion is usually not one of them, although there might be religious overtones associated with various conflicts, but not necessarily the primary reason for it. I mean, medieval people, who growing up, medieval people transported to today's world would be shocked that, the Second World War was fought over what the Second World War, for example, was fought over. Just as certain secularists today would be transported back to the 12th century and be shocked at what kind of conflict was happening.
Yeah, but imagine most conflicts would be over territory and things like that. But so I have this theory that the Crusades actually prevented an apocalypse, because I'm being bombastic with that term, but if the world had been overtaken by Islam, it would have been the end of a world. It would have been like the end of a Roman Empire if all of Christendom had collapsed and falling to Islam, because there was a point where Islam had gone completely into Spain. I mean, they were on a rampage taking over Christian territory, right?
They were, and that's a good point to kind of break down here the crusading movement, right? So when we talk about Crusades, it's even among historians, there's significant debate as to how you define a crusade and what is a crusade and what's not a crusade. But that's usually the debate realm arena of very heavily specialized academics. But And generally speaking, right, the crusading movement lasted anywhere from 600 to 700 years, depending on how you want to, port the end, or how you want to date the ending of it, because there's some interpretation of that. But so let's say 600 years, right? The movement exists. So it's not a monolithic movement for those 600 years, as nothing is for that long, right? In human history, there are changes to it. There are phases. There's development. There's changes in goals and perspectives and whatnot. And so for the first, phase, let's say, of the crusading movement, right, these are crusades, these are campaigns launched against Muslim forces in the North Africa and in what is today the Holy Land, right, the Middle East, we call it, to reconquer or to liberate, really, ancient Christian territory, right? That's the focus.
Yeah.
There's debate, as you brought up Spain, right? There's debate about whether or not, the Reconquista in Spain is part of the crusading movement or not part of the crusading movement, wherever you fall out on that. But that was going on around this time as well, right? So in that point, it's the crusading movement is these defensive operations, military operations designed to liberate this ancient Christian territory and stop the persecution of Christians, both pilgrims from Europe as well as indigenous Christians and Jews living in the area at the time. Then, you have the establishment after the success of the First Crusade of what's known as the so-called Crusader states, these feudal territories that exist along the coast, the 600-mile frontier along the coast, mostly of what the First Crusaders were able to liberate. And those last till about the end of the 13th century to 1291, when all that territory that the Crusaders had liberated is now reconquered by Islam, right? And so then after that, the crusading movement kind of focuses into a different phase, or I should say shifts into a different phase, and it's more of a defensive phase of defense of the homeland. This is where in the 14th century, into the 15th, you see the rise of the Ottoman Turks. Constantinople falls to the Turks in 1453. They then begin to make incursions into the Balkan states of Europe now, Eastern Europe, and all the way up into Vienna, to the gates of Vienna and Austria. So it becomes a much more, no kidding, defense of the European homeland type of movement. Whereas prior to that, it was, outside of Europe, right, to North Africa and the Holy Land. So
when does European Christendom start to develop knighthoods and things like that? Did you get to dive into any of that? I don't know. Would that be in the time period they would call the Dark Ages, which I think is an absurd term to use, but
yeah, it is an absurd term. I mean, yeah. So feudal society, and that's again, you're within the academic community. There's still a lot of discussion, debate on what is the feudal. When does feudal society begin? What does it really consist of? Can we even say there's something called the feudal system? And because there's debates about that. In certain parts of Europe, you had certain elements. In other parts of Europe, you didn't have elements of knighthood and inheritance of land and these kinds of things, right? So yeah, you're looking at, again, if you want to take the traditional approach of when did feudalism rise, or this kind of medieval class of people really, where I think we could generally say that medieval society really kind of coalesced itself or organized itself around three different classes of people. There were those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. It's just an easy way to describe it, right? I'm generalizing here,
of course. Yeah.
But that's the general
Well,
thought, right?
Well, you would have the aristocracy in there too, right? You'd have aristocrats, then you'd have the peasants, then you'd have monks, and you'd have warriors, I guess.
Those who fought, those who worked, and those who prayed, right? That's exactly what it is. Yeah. So you have the knights, you have the aristocracy. So, and basically what that is, with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire at the end of the 5th century in Europe, right? So central governing authority devolves down to local chieftains, if you will, local warlords who, had the power, had the land, had the time and the effort to train and martial skills, and then hand that on to others and to make sure that continued, right? So, you're looking at the end of the 5th century, into the 9th and 10th centuries, and definitely by the 11th century, you have what we would consider this knightly class, right? This nobility of varying levels, that have the money, have the time, because they rely on the work of others to feed them, to be able to train in weapons, and to be able to defend those who are working and to defend those who are praying for everyone, the monks in the church. So yeah, by the 11th century, you have this kind of very developed nobility within most areas of Europe, what we know as modern Europe today. And then that continues to change, right? How one becomes a knight also changes. It can, it's initially through inheritance only, and then it can be granted to others. And there are knights who are landed, who have their own land. There are knights who don't have their own land, and they rent it from a lord, and then they, have serfs who work it. So there's a lot of diversification and stratification of European society, medieval society at the time. But generally speaking, that's
so now is Europe at this time, is it like completely scattered where there's like, are these knights feuding with each other and stuff, and then they kind of get united around a common cause? Is that kind of what happens?
Yeah, generally speaking. So you have at this time, right, you don't, it's not a system of nation states like as we know today, right? That develops much, much later in European history. So you have kingdoms, principalities, dukedoms really is what kind of exists. And so, there's this interlinkage of relationship among people. So you have lords and vassals, and you could be, the lord, you could be a lord and have vassals pledge their fealty and obedience to you, but you could also then be a vassal of somebody else, right? So for example, the King of England is probably the best example of that, right? You could be the King of England, but then also be a vassal of the French king because of the, lands, from Aquitaine and whatnot that many of the English kings in Normandy, that many of the English kings had with them from the time of, King William. So William the Conqueror. So, and when we talk about kings, one thing to keep in mind at this period of time in medieval society, they're not kings like we understand kings. They're not absolutist kings where they control everything in what is, modern day France or modern day England. These are kings who are important and who, other lords or barons in England look to and who are obedient to a certain degree. But they have to do more. They rule more by persuasion than by command, right? Because they don't control the whole territory. They have to rely on very powerful allies, nobles, lords to help them do whatever they want to do. So that's what you see with the crusading movement, for example, when the First Crusade is called in the late 11th century by Pope Urban II. You see these various army groups kind of assemble, and these army groups, or these knights that assemble to participate in the First Crusade, they organize themselves around their lord, right? The most powerful lord that they have fealty, that they pledge fealty to. And so these different army groups, there were 5 of them that were a major part of the First Crusade. There's no unified command structure with these guys at all. Like, they're not how we understand modern day armies. There's no one supreme commander or one, overlord general or whatever. They're basically, one historian described them as, a group of knights, a group of warriors, united for a common cause, going in the same general direction, but all following, different leaders and different routes and different things. And so the noble leaders had to get together and discuss and decide, what are we going to do? We're going to go here, we're going to go there. And they could disagree and people could spin off, which happened. The fact that they were able to accomplish what they did is really quite amazing, given, how they were structured, really.
Now are there, you mentioned,
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Rob.
We don't often hear about the average crusader. We're often told that the Crusaders were second and third sons who were out for treasure and riches and things like that. Is that true? And if not, who was the average Crusader?
Yeah, great question.
Why were they fighting?
Yeah, so the first part, who were they? I was taught that myth of the second, third, fourth born sons, right? When I was an undergrad. I mean, the myth goes like this, basically, that, Europe in the 11th century, by the 11th century, had gone through this major population growth, which that part of the myth is true. It had for a multitude of different reasons. And so then the myth continues, though, that, well, because of that second, third, and fourth born son and the rules of primogeniture, and the firstborn son is the one that inherits all of the family land. You have all these second, third born sons who have nothing to do. They're all going around killing each other and fighting each other, trying to take everybody's land, other people's lands. And the church comes in and says, well, this is bad. We need to have peace. We can't have these people fighting with each other. Let's all marshal them together and send them to the Holy Land to fight Muslims and get their own land there, right? Excuse me. So, which seems logical. It seems, oh, yeah, sure, that makes a lot of sense, right? But then, there's one historian, Jonathan Riley Smith, I mentioned him earlier. He comes along in, the 70s, 80s, and he begins to kind of peel back the onion on that story a bit and say, well, is that really true? And he dives really deep into the genealogical records, especially in France, in modern day France, which is where the vast majority of First Crusaders came from. And he found his findings were shocking, right? It revolutionized the whole way we see the Crusades. He found overwhelmingly it wasn't second, third, and fourth born sons who went on crusade. It was firstborn sons. So from the myth perspective, right, that the ones who stood the most to lose were the ones that went. And he, explained that in from a perspective of that the French noble families who participated and answered Urban's call, Urban himself, who was a Frenchman, they knew this was important. They loved the church. They had a great devotion to Jerusalem, the holy city itself, which Urban knew, and he kind of played on that, if you will, to marshal the troops to go. They wanted to send. They knew it was important. They wanted to send the most important person in their family.
Yeah.
Firstborn son, to go and to participate. And so that's what happened. Now, there was obviously second, third, fourthborn sons who went. But overwhelmingly, there were firstborn men who went, from France in particular. And why did they go? To Rob's second question, again, multitude of different reasons that people gave. But Jonathan Riley Smith also did a lot of work in this area. And what he found was he looked at what are called charters. And so the best way to describe what a charter is today is it's like a title for your house. When you go buy a house, you go and you get the title research done. You have to pay for that to make sure your title's free and clear, and you sign the title. And then it's a legal document that says, I own this piece of property. I own this house. Well, same thing in the Middle Ages, right? They created what are called charters. And in the charters, it was a legal transaction of real estate, in essence. And warfare is expensive. And the soldiers who went, the knights who went on the First Crusade, they had to, raise the money for their own campaign, their own expenses. And most of the time, the way they did that was to sell a piece of property. And so when they sold a property or gave a property to a monastery, for example, for free, they would write in these charters. It wasn't just, I, Odo of Burgundy, give, this orchard to the monastery of, or the monastery at Cluny for, prayers and supplications while I'm away. It was, I, Odo of Burgundy, give this orchard to the monks of Cluny because I am going on the Passagia, the pilgrimage to the Holy Land because of my many sins, because, I'm concerned for those in the Holy Land who are my fellow Christians who are being persecuted. And they would list all these reasons and explain why they're doing this. And Jonathan Riley Smith saw that and then was able to compile this picture of the one of the main motivators, if not the main motivator for most Crusaders, not all, but most, was that spiritual component of they had this desire to do something good for Christ and the church, and they wanted to receive the spiritual benefit that Urban promised those who went, which was the indulgence. And this was a unique thing for people at the time to receive.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what does Urban actually promise these soldiers?
He promises them a plenary indulgence, so the remission, of the temporal punishment due to sin, whose guilt has already been forgiven in the sacrament of confession. So. And for men at the time, especially the noble class at the time, to receive an indulgence now in the church, it's I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's much more available than it had been before then, right? So before this period of time, to receive an indulgence, one would have to go on pilgrimage or do other kind of penitential work. But as a warrior, you couldn't take your weapons, right? If you went on pilgrimage up until before the Crusades, you had to go so unarmed. And for someone who, was raised from an early age to be that societal protector, to utilize, these skills that you have accumulated your entire life, to set all that aside, to go to a shrine was huge. It was a huge decision. It's penitential, obviously, but also you're a little bit worried, right? If you're always used to walking around with your weapon to protect yourself and now you don't have it, that can be kind of scary. So men tended not to do it as much. So Urban comes along and says, no, I want you to use all these skills that you've accumulated, and I want you to put them at the service of Christ and the church, not for any selfish service. And I want you to go and help your fellow Christians in the Holy Land. And liberate this territory, this ancient Christian territory, and from the hands of Islam. And because that's so penitential, because it's so far away, because the chances of you dying are extremely high. 80% of those who went on the First Crusade never came home.
80%.
80%. Yeah, the casualty rate was through the roof. And most of that actually was not from direct combat fatalities. It was
from starvation, sickness, things like that.
Sickness and disease. And so, but because it's that risky, I will grant the plenary indulgence for anyone who participates. And men at the time and others knew, these noble families knew that was a unique opportunity, and no one knew if that was going to continue, right? No one thought, oh, there's going to be a second crusade, there's going to be a third crusade,
Yeah.
this is what we're doing. And so it was a unique opportunity to receive this immense spiritual benefit, and that was the prime motivator for most of those who went. Not the only motivator, but the prime motivator for most.
I think one of the biggest, like one of the saddest things about the modern world, and we've talked about it on the show a bunch, is our loss of the sense of sin and our loss of the importance of penance. And I really don't think you can get yourself into the mindset of these men unless you really understand the gravity that all of medieval society really took sin to be on their souls. It's like we're in a time of where all we hear about is mercy and and God's love and things like that we've forgotten about God's wrath to a degree. We've forgotten about fear of God. And the primary motivator for these guys, did they still think they would get that plenary indulgence no matter what they do going into this war, or they were going into this as Christian men, especially for the earlier Crusades, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, there was this understanding that, participating in this armed pilgrimage that we call the Crusade, they didn't call it that, but that it was something unique and different, right? It's warfare, but it's a different kind of warfare, and that you're a different kind of army, right? They did really see themselves as God's army, if you will, and they knew that they had a holy purpose. Now, that doesn't mean everybody was a saint. It doesn't mean that everybody on the Crusades acted in a saintly manner, because that's not true, right? But again, the vast majority recognized that there was something unique with this endeavor, with this campaign and expedition, and they were expected to act differently. So things that were normal in a non-crusade, military campaign, if you will, at the time, swearing, gambling, whoring, all these kinds of pillaging, all these kinds of things were not allowed on campaign if you're on a crusade. And I mean, there are examples in the records and the chronicles of Crusaders, who violated that understanding and who were taken to task for it, either had some kind of public penance they had to perform, or even some who were killed, frankly, for the things that they had done that was against the penitential nature of the campaign. And so they knew that, and many of them prepared in a penitential way before they went, right? Many went to a local shrine or a local pilgrimage place to pray and ask for, the monks or their priests to pray for them, or they would perform other kind of penitential practices. I mean, King Louis VII, for example, who went on the Second Crusade, went to a leper house and ministered to lepers outside of Paris before he left on crusade, right? Because he didn't do that when he went and fought, a nobleman in the neighboring, territory, but he did on the crusade because he knew it was something different and unique.
Nick, you could jump in too. I know I'm hogging most of the conversation here, but if you have anything you want to jump in with, you can. But
I have kind of a two-part question. It kind of falls upon what he said. So when we're looking at the holiness of the individuals, one figure that comes out to me, I'm a huge fan of Crusade studies, is Duke Godfrey in the First Crusade. And even secular historians that I've read have admitted that Duke Godfrey was a man of piety. He brought along, from what I've read, several monks with him to minister to him as he went. Could you speak to one, I guess my first part of the question is the piety of the men who went there, particularly like Duke Godfrey himself. But then two, when it comes to the divine assistance received on crusade, there's several famous legends. There's the famous legend of the discovery of the Holy Lance, and then the famous discovery of the wood that was needed to build these two towers that went into the siege of Jerusalem after all of the trees had been leveled by the Muslims. So could you speak to both of those?
Yeah, so I mean, take the first one, Godfrey de Bouillon, who was one of the major crusade leaders on the First Crusade, was by all accounts, a very pious individual, somebody who looked at the campaign from that perspective. There were other crusade leaders. Bohemond, for example, was one, the Norman Bohemond, who comes to mind, who was really, he would be one of those guys who kind of talked the talk about, this is a holy campaign, but he was really focused on trying to find himself some land and some other things that he wanted to do and enrich himself to a certain extent. But Bohemond, or Godfrey rather, was somebody who, from all accounts, was not that, right? Many accounts of him during the campaign, selflessly putting himself in danger to help his fellow warriors. You know, right at the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem, for example, he's in one of the siege towers, you know, holding it up to make sure when it's hit, so it doesn't get destroyed fully. He's kind of holding it together. He's helping all of his fellow men, and led from the front, right? So he was somebody who was really recognized and beloved by his troops. And, you know, the legend goes that continued on after the success of the liberation of the Holy City of Jerusalem in the summer of 1099. The Crusaders are trying to figure out, what do we do? How do we manage this territory now that we've liberated? And the idea was to create these feudal kingdoms, right? Or these feudal territories, the Crusader states, we call them, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem was one of them. And so then the thought was, well, we got to pick a king. And so they went to one individual, Count Raymond of Toulouse, initially, and said, you know, do you want to be king? He kind of said, well, I don't want to be king, but it was more from the perspective of, I don't want to be seen to be wanting to be king, but I kind of really want to be king, but I don't want to say that I want to be king, that kind of perspective. So they passed over him because he told them, well, I don't want it. So they went on to somebody else. They went on to
must have been like, oh no.
Like, oh,
whoa.
Yeah, but he went to Godfrey. And, Godfrey said that he would not be king, right? The tradition holds that he has this famous quote, right? That's it's probably apocryphal, but it's in keeping with the spirit of who he was, where he said, I will not take a crown of gold in the city where my Savior wore a crown of thorns. So he refused, right, to become king. Instead, he took the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. And so he held that title for a year, and then he died. But his brother Baldwin, who was up in Edessa, heard that his brother had died, and he rushed down to Jerusalem and had no qualms about taking the title of king. Becomes the first king of Jerusalem. Right?
Little brothers are like that.
Yeah, little brothers like that. So, so that happens with him. And then the point about the wood. Sure, by the time the remaining Crusade army gets to Jerusalem as part of the First Crusade in the summer of 1099, they don't have a lot of equipment. Many of the knights don't have their horses anymore. They don't have a lot of wood or any wood really to build siege towers. And a couple of things happen. They find some wood kind of miraculously in a cave outside of Jerusalem that they're able to utilize for some of the siege engines and towers. And then unbeknownst to them, a group of English, actually, Crusaders and some Italian Crusaders with ships came sailing into Jaffa, right, the port near Jerusalem, and lo and behold, had wood and brought wood with them in their holds, and actually used some of the wood off the ships as well. And they had with them military engineers who knew how to build siege engines. And so that was seen as miraculous by the Crusaders as well. And they were able to put those siege engines and towers together to liberate the city. So the First Crusade is really one of the major crusades where you see a lot of, and the participants believed that it was, many instances of divine intervention along the path for them. Other crusades, not as much, but definitely the First Crusade. Yeah.
While we're talking about the siege of Jerusalem, we often hear a lot about so-called Crusader atrocities, such as the so-called massacre after the siege of Jerusalem and such. Were those so-called atrocities unique to the Crusaders, or was it more common among everyone at the time? And I mean, were these atrocities even really like what we're told they are?
Yeah, great question. And that comes up every time I, give a talk usually about the Crusades. Somebody's saying, what about the massacre of Jerusalem? And so it's something that I address in the book as well, obviously, and many Crusade historians have done so. So what we can say factually, right, we know that warfare at the time, 11th century warfare, was such that if you're an army and you approach a city, and you want the city, usually you give terms, you want the city to surrender. Armies at that time, they wanted intact cities. They didn't want to destroy the city. They didn't want to kill everybody inside the city. They're looking for the city to remain intact for economic reasons, for, equipment reasons, for all kinds of different reasons. And so you give terms. If the city doesn't agree to your terms, then it was understood from everybody engaging in warfare at the time, Christians, Muslims, others, that if you get into the city, if you're the army and you're successful to get into the city, besieging army, you get into the city, you can destroy the city. You can do whatever you want in the city. It's now yours, right? Whatever terms you promised, it's null and void now because the city decided they didn't want to accept them. So I'm in here, I can do what I want. And that did happen on both sides. When the Crusaders in the First Crusade went into Jerusalem in the summer of 1099, they did, kill people. I mean, it's a siege, it's a war. Combatants and non-combatants both were killed. But the issue here is the so-called massacre, right? What was the level, if you will, or the numbers of people that were killed, and how should that event be placed into context appropriately? It should not be utilized, as former President Bill Clinton did in 2000, shortly after the September 11th attacks of 2001, to say that's the reason why the United States in the West was attacked on September 11th, 2001, is because of
Yeah,
this.
that's one of those big narrative pushes that I was talking about earlier in the episode.
Yeah, it's historically inaccurate for him to say that, and it's inappropriate, right? Or was inappropriate for him to say it. It is inappropriate, but and just not true, right? Because there's a lot of misunderstanding about that, what happened in the event. Again, combatants, non-combatants were killed. The most serious historical and academic study I've seen and I've read on this topic estimates that could be anywhere from several hundred to about 3,000 people that the Crusaders probably killed, right? Combatants, non-combatants, and most of those would have been, combatants, but a good number of non-combatants as well, right? So that contrasts with, most of the narratives that are presented, that's tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands or whatever of people that were wantonly killed, and many, many Jews and things like that. I mean, there are Jewish people in the city, and the Crusaders, they were casualties of the Crusaders coming into the city as well. But one of the kind of origins, if you will, of this myth is from the chronicles of the Crusaders themselves, right? Those who went on crusade, who were there, who wrote about this later or wrote about it during the time, would say things like, we killed so many that the blood of, those we killed ran up to our knees or ran up to the bridle of our horses in particular. You see that phrase in multiple different chronicles of the time. And we as 21st century Westerners, we see that or read that and we freak out and go, oh my gosh, I mean, it must have been, tens of thousands of people that they killed to have blood running that high. Because we have this sense of warfare that CNN has given to us, where we have embedded reporters and they're telling you exactly minute by minute what is really happening on these campaigns. But medieval people didn't do that, right? And those who wrote the chronicles, again, this is a society, as you mentioned, Anthony, earlier, that is rooted in the church and rooted in Christian tradition and Christian imagery and understanding of the scripture in particular. And so these chroniclers knew that if they wrote a phrase that said, we killed so many that the blood ran to the bridle of our horses, their listeners and their readers, those who were educated back in Europe, would immediately recall Revelation 14:20, where you have, God passing judgment, right, during the apocalypse. And you have that phrase that, they come and the judgment was issued on the earth and blood ran up to the bridle of the horses of the horsemen of the apocalypse. They would know that and they go, oh, that means that God favored our army and brought judgment on, in their minds, in their terms, right, the heathen, the Muslims, who had occupied Jerusalem inappropriately. So it was where
when modern man reads it, we're like, look at the massacre, and they're writing it from the perspective of saying, no, we had God on our side, so much so that the prophecies are fulfilled.
Exactly. Right. And again, it's not to say that there weren't casualties and there weren't, tens of thousands, or at least several thousand people, probably around 3,000 or so people that were killed. So it's not to diminish that. And it's not to say everything was great, but, these guys were absolute saints or whatever from our perspective. But you have to, again, place that event in context and not use it, as former President Bill Clinton did, inappropriately, to further your own agenda of whatever your agenda is, right?
What could you speak about? Because this is kind of an interesting follow-up. One, I agree with you, because when you compare the siege of Jerusalem at that time to another siege of Jerusalem, 70 AD, when the Romans went in, they massacred everybody, and, to where historians estimates up to potentially 1 million people being slaughtered in the city. But what is, I guess, when we look at the chronicles of church history, we see the Crusades. We also see Saint Joan of Arc, famous warrior who, according to her own, if you will, story, she claims that our Lord gave her, a sword and gave her the entrustment of going and fighting the English in the 100 Years' War. And so I'm curious, what is the role of physical holy warfare in the mind of the church? Because, today we see, of course, very many liberal prelates who they go on the nonstop apology tour for the church, apologizing for everything, to the point where they're apologizing for the gospel, but they'll of course apologize for the Crusades. And so, what is the role of physical spiritual warfare in the temporal sphere, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I approach it from a historical perspective. I mean, the church through most through history has understood that there's warfare is a necessary evil, is I guess one way to
Mhm.
put it, right? That there are times when war is something that has to happen. It's not something one desires or one necessarily wants to happen, but is necessary at times, right? So I mean, the early Christians and the early church wrestled with this particular question, right, of violence and of sanctified violence, if you will, and when it's proper and when it's not. And so you had the Old Testament, right, understanding of violence and warfare. I mean, Exodus, the Israelites, after the Lord destroys the Egyptian army, as they're crossing through the Red Sea and then drowns all of Pharaoh's favorite charioteers as crack troops, if
Mhm.
you will. The Israelites, shout, "The Lord is a warrior. Lord is
Mhm.
His name." Right? I mean, they recognized that God was a warrior and that they were called to fight in a holy way, right? And so, especially to make sure that they had occupation of the Promised Land in particular. And so they didn't. And but why did the Lord do that? Right? The Lord had them fight those tribes in the Promised Land, those other tribes, because He didn't want the Israelites to result or to go back into idolatry like they had in
Mhm.
Egypt. Right? That's the whole purpose of getting them out of Egypt, was to stop idolatry and to worship the one true God. So warfare had a very particular sanctified purpose in the Old Testament, and the church understood that and knew that. Then, as you move into the New Testament, you have Christ and his teachings on violence and his teachings on peace and his teachings on mercy and forgiveness. And so there's all this, how the church then wrestled with that question of, well, how do we reconcile these two kind of thoughts, if you will. And there was some significant disagreement. So many early Christians thought that Christians, you couldn't be a Christian to be in the Roman army, for example. Some even flip-flopped on that. Tertullian, for example, the early church father, originally said it was okay for Christians to be in the army, and then later, when he became a Montanist, said no, you can't be in the army anymore. So
Mhm.
so it was a real serious question. But eventually, along comes St. Augustine, and he's the one who kind of brings this all together, these two different traditions, and brings in some Roman understanding of law, or of war rather, as well, and develops obviously what we know as the just war theory, or
Mhm.
understanding things, right? That their warfare is at times necessary if it meets certain conditions.
Mhm.
And that's how the church has kind of seen things throughout most of history. And in today, as you mentioned, Nicholas, right, there's some different, I think, interpretations that are there, that are influenced perhaps more by secular kinds of ideas and Enlightenment ideas than really more Judeo-Christian and scriptural ideas. But
Mhm.
Somebody saying, can we make this a multi-part series? We were going to try and break this up into two parts and do part Crusades, and then we were going to just ask you general church history stuff.
yeah.
But there's too much on the
I I was
Crusades. We're
gonna,
gonna have
I
to
was
have
gonna
you
say
back
I still have
on.
a few more questions.
Are you on a time limit, Steve?
So about an hour I have, but yeah, so we have some more time.
Okay, so we got a little time left
Happy
with
to
you,
come
but
back. If you guys have
Um,
available slots, happy to come back at some future date.
yeah, that'd be awesome. But to go back to something you brought up earlier with what what President Clinton said about the Crusades and the Islamic Jihad, more or less, that started after 2001. We're told that that it was the Crusades that started more or less the current
Mhm.
attitude of the Islamic world against the West. We're told that it's almost this deep-seated, almost like racial memory that they have. That we started this war. How true is that, or how inaccurate is that?
Yeah, it's not very accurate. I mean, that's one of the major myths that I address in the book, and it's this whole notion, right, in the Western world now, that it's this kind of false mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa. We're the ones that brought about all this, um, you know. Uh, Al Qaeda and Boko Haram back in the day, and ISIS and all these other various Islamic groups, at Hamas and Hezbollah, who are attacking, Israelis, or the Western world. And it's, when you look at the history of it, again, peel the onion back on it, you see that really the first serious history of the Crusades wasn't written in Arabic until 1899 in the Arab world. So it wasn't until the late 19th century. For most Muslims, the Crusades were a non-historical event until the 19th century, 19th, 20th century, really. And the reason for that, multiple reasons for that, but one reason is, frankly, the Crusader states only existed for about 200 years, a little less than 200 years. So in the long scheme of things, it really is not a significant part of
what was it? What's a Crusader state? Is that like like the Crusaders occupied a territory after they?
Correct. Yeah. So after liberation of the Holy City of Jerusalem in the summer of 1099, you had the creation of these four different feudal territories, right? From north to south, about 600 miles of what territory that the First Crusade had liberated. So it was the county of Edessa, the county of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And so the last Crusader city, the city of Acre on the coast, fell in 1291. And so that is the end, if you will, of the Crusader states in the Latin East. And so there's no longer any significant feudal territories that are held by Christians anymore, right? That as an organizational hold, a political hold. It doesn't mean there weren't Christians still living in the area. There was, but the major European rulers, or those who had grown up in the Latin East since the time of the First Crusade, from European stock, were gone, right? Those political leaders were gone. And so that's, you're looking at 1099 to 1291. I mean, it's less than 200 years. It was not a significant event, right? And so what ends up happening is, it's a lost memory for the most part. But then what happens is, when you get to the 19th century, with the kind of end of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, as the Turkish Empire begins to significantly decline as you get into the 19th century, and then completely disbands as a result of, the First World War and them siding with Germany and losing out on all that. Then you begin and the establishment of the British Mandate in Palestine, the French in Syria, early in the 20th century, and these kind of European,
the beginning of all our modern day drama.
Right. You have all this kind of modern day European colonialism going on in the area, and a growing sense of, Muslim and Arab nationalism, in particular, as you get into the 60s and 70s. Combine that with some Marxism and some other things that are going on, right, in the political world and the geopolitical world at the time. Then you begin to have this growth of Islamic radicals who want to get rid of, more Muslim secular governments, right? We see this in a multitude of different countries, Iran, Egypt, other places, Turkey. And so Turkey kind of went the other way around, but went more secular. But they begin to then kind of gravitate, these radicals, if you will, at the time, towards a more devout, if you will, understanding and expression of Islam. And then they begin to look for ways to explain, why Islam wasn't ascendant anymore, right? And so then it begins, because we have the Europeans here, right? It's because it started with the Crusades, right? These European colonial powers, the first initial foray of their colonial efforts were the Crusades. And so then it becomes this kind of boogeyman, if you will, in the Arab world through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the modern day, where that becomes the issue, whereas it wasn't for the vast majority of time, right? It was actually the memory of many of the kind of Arab or Muslim, I should say, really, Muslim heroes of the Crusades, if you will, or major characters, was maintained in Europe rather than in the Muslim world. So, for example, Saladin, right, Salah ad-Din, the great Muslim general of the Third Crusade, who retook the city of Jerusalem at the end of the 12th century in 1189. His tomb in Damascus was completely overgrown by the late 19th century. Was in complete disrepair, was cracking. And when Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany showed up to Damascus and he wanted to see the tomb, nobody could tell him where it was. He actually searched around for a long period of time to find a tour guide who even knew where it was, or somebody who knew where it was. Took him to it. He saw what in such decrepit state it was that he spent his own money to repair the tomb and make it magnificent, because he had heard so much growing up about this magnificent and tolerant Saladin. And, in his mind, it was he was flabbergasted that they wouldn't, remember him. And so it was a reconstituted European memory, which then kind of folds itself back into the 70s, 80s, and 90s in these various areas of the Muslim world, in that part of the world. And so it's other people, Beybers, for example, who was a Mamluk, general in Egypt and ultimate sultan. He was remembered more, frankly, because he did more than Saladin did. But in the West, Sir Walter Scott and others kind of propped up Saladin as this great tolerant Muslim character in opposition to King Richard, in opposition to the Crusaders, because of their animus towards the church, that it painted this false picture. So
it seems like all of history is just that, is just enemies of the church painting a false picture to paint the church in a bad light. You'd mentioned at the beginning of the episode that there were women crusaders. There were women crusaders?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, anybody could take the cross. Men, women, even non-combatants. Although that's not what Pope Urban wanted initially, and even follow-on popes didn't want non-combatants to take the cross necessarily, but they didn't prevent them from taking it. So voluntary action, you could take the Crusader vow, it was called, and become a cruce signati, or someone signed with the cross, where you vowed to go on the crusade. Initially, that vow was to specifically go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem.
So this was just a pilgrimage they were going on.
Yep.
Mainly. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you had non-combatant women. You also had very famous women. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, was a crusader. So yeah.
Now you named the book "The Glory of the Crusades." So we always want to combat some of the myths about the Crusades, but what was glorious about these Crusades? Because I'm so tired of the modern narrative that we're fed. And what made you even go with that title?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that question, Anthony, because when the book came out, as I've said earlier in the beginning of the show, right, it's been 10 years since the book came out. But when it first came out and I was doing a lot of interviews on the book, I got asked that question a lot. And some people weren't very happy with the title and misinterpreted how I was trying to use the phrase. But I'm very clear in the book in explaining why I used the title. There's two reasons, really. One reason is in the Old Testament, the word that's most associated, the Hebrew word that's most associated with the glory of God is the Hebrew word kavod. And kavod means something heavy in weight, or something we would translate it as something important, like extremely important and critical. And so in my mind, the Crusades are one of those historical events that is critical for Catholics to understand. It's so important for us to know the authentic history of this movement, because it occupied a significant period of time in our church's life and history, right? So we're talking 600 years of the church's existence. The church was actively involved. Yeah, it was actively involved in promoting this movement. I mean, you had Catholic popes exhorting Catholic men and providing Catholic spiritual benefits for them to participate in these events and these expeditions. So as Catholics today in the modern world, we need to understand why. What were these events? Why was there so much effort and focus on it? And why for so long a period of time? And it's not, the simple answer is the wrong answer is, we can't just say, oh, well, that's something bad. We have to, not talk about it or apologize for it, as you said, Nicholas, or, whatever. That's not the right answer in my view, right? They're glorious because they were important to a lot of Catholics for a long period of time. So if we really want to understand our history and know about the men and women who came before us in faith, and how they lived their faith, and maybe things we can learn from them about how they did that, then we need to know what this movement was and why it was so important for them. So that's one reason. The second reason I picked was, and I put this quote in the book, it's from the English historian Hilaire Belloc, who wrote a multitude of different kinds of histories. But he wrote a history on the Crusades as well, a bit dated now with some of the research that's come out of the last 50, 60 years since he wrote, but a good book nonetheless. And his viewpoint was, he's writing in the 30s. So he's writing in a time when 20s and 30s, he's writing in a time like post World War I, before World War II, where you have the British mandate in Palestine, where you have French forces in Syria, you have these European colonial powers in the Holy Land. And he's really writing about this return, but writing as it from what he calls a lack of glory, right? So his point is that when Europe went to that part of the world before, it went in faith. And now in his time, it's going because of secular reasons, political reasons, economic reasons. And there's this deficit of European life because of this lack of faith. And he wanted to restore this understanding of the glory of the Crusades and the glory of the faith of those who participated, to kind of call his own time, back to a more faithful expression of the Catholic faith. So that's another reason why. And I appreciated that quote, and I thought his point is right on. So I wanted to bring that into a more modern audience. And that was the point of the book, was to take a lot of this modern crusade scholarship that's been mostly in academia and only in academia for the last 40, 50 years, and bring it to a wider audience.
Mm-hmm. The one thing I always get pushed back on when I discuss the Crusade. Well, first, there's two things. One is, I find discussing the Crusades is a great way to engage with Protestants, because they don't even realize the Crusaders were all Catholic. Like they want to be
or
part of
just
this.
how Catholic it was.
So
yeah.
just how Catholic the Crusades were, right? That they'll even take on like Crusader imagery in their profile pictures and things like that. It's like, wait a minute, you don't get to do that. You guys, it wasn't a single Protestant in the Crusades. Okay?
Guys, St. Paul wrote the King James Bible. Just get over it, all right?
If it was good enough for St. Paul, it's good enough for me. And the other, I get a little pushback from the Eastern Orthodox about the sacking of Constantinople. What's the controversy with the sacking of Constantinople?
So how much time do we have? No.
I saved it for the end.
Yeah, save it for the end. That's a whole nother episode of this. But I get I get asked about the sack of Constantinople frequently. I mean, to try to sum it up briefly, right? So early 13th century, you've had Jerusalem has been reconquered by Islamic forces. Multiple crusades have been called to address this. You have Pope Innocent III, who's the Pope now, and he's very much involved in the crusading movement, a huge proponent of the crusading movement, called more crusades than any Pope throughout the entire length of the movement.
Wait, which Pope was this?
This is Innocent III.
Innocent III, okay.
So Innocent calls this crusade together. He wants some of the major monarchs, Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, to go, but they're fighting and warring, and then Richard dies, and so then it's all this, it might not even happen. But eventually you have this minor crusade, or this minor lord in Count Thibault of Champagne, who decides he's going to go on crusade. He has a big tournament in his area, and all these knights are there. He makes the crusade vow publicly at the tournament, and then many others join him, right? So then they decide, well, we're going to follow the Third Crusade and go to the Holy Land, not by land, as the First Crusade and Second Crusade did. Instead, we're going to go by sea. We're going to take sea transports, quicker, faster. Except, hey, we're all from inland France, and we don't have a fleet, so we got to get a fleet. Where do we go? We have to go to Venice. So we go to Venice. We ask the Venetians, hey, can you build us a fleet? Venetians are like, sure. How many people do you think you're going to have come? And the Crusaders said, well, I don't know, maybe 33,000 or so. They just pulled that number out of the air. They literally did not know how many people were going to show up. They had, didn't have a roll or anything of who would show. They just guessed it. So the Venetians said, okay, well, that's pretty large number. We're going to have to suspend our merchant activity for an entire year to build this fleet. So we're going to put ourselves in a significant economic issue here. One historian has likened it to, let's say, the federal government goes to United Airlines and says, we want you to cease flying everywhere for an entire year and just give us, at the end of the year, we're going to load up all your planes with people and fly them to a certain area, right? So just imagine the amount of economic, capital you've got invested in this endeavor and that you're putting out here is a lot of risk. So the Venetians did that. When the Crusaders they entered into a treaty. When the Crusaders show up, around the assembly point in the summer, they don't have enough people. They have less than half of the people they said they were going to have. And so the Venetians, the ruler of Venice at the time, is this guy by the name of Enrico Dandolo. He's the Doge, or the leader of Venice. He says, well, you still owe us the money for the 33,000 people you said were going to be here. So pay up. The Crusaders didn't have enough money to pay up because they were expecting people to pay their own way. And now they're in a bind. And so Dandolo says, well, okay, here's one way you can help me. Across the Adriatic, there's this little area called Zara. It used to be Venetian territory, but now it's territory held by the King of Hungary. We want you to help us get that territory back. And if you do that, then that'll pay some of your debt. But what do you guys think? And the Crusade rulers and the leaders, the noblemen said, well, Zara is under the protection of the Christian King of Hungary, and he's taken the Crusader vow, although he hasn't left yet. And according to the law of the church, if I attack a fellow Crusader's land or any Crusader's land, I'm automatically excommunicated. So I'm not certain I want to do that. But Dandolo says, well, you kind of have to because you owe me money.
Italian.
And Innocent steps in and says, this is only the beginning of the story, right? So he says, don't do it. They don't listen. Some of them listen to Innocent and they don't go. Some don't. They go with the Venetians. They sack the city of Zara. They hand it over to the Venetians. And now it's the end of the winter season, sailing season is over, so they can't continue on. So they have to winter over, if you will, in Zara. While they're there, this renegade representatives from this renegade Byzantine prince, a man by the name of Alexius Angelus, whose father who'd been the emperor in Constantinople, but had been deposed by his own brother, blinded and put in jail. So his father is Isaac. So the son, Alexius, sends representatives to the Crusaders. He sees that they're there, and he had actually been on this European roadshow Alexius had, trying to generate support for him to put his father back on the throne and get him back in line to be the heir of the throne in Constantinople. So he goes to he has representatives go to the Crusaders and Zara and says, hey, I got a deal for you. If you guys help me take back Constantinople, I'll give you all this money. I'll give you troops to help you on your way to Jerusalem, and I'll reunite the churches. How about that? So promising a lot of things that he had no ability to actually deliver on, but promised it nonetheless. Innocent hears about this, Pope Innocent. He says, don't do it. Don't go to Constantinople. They ignore him. They go to Constantinople anyways. They think they're going to be welcomed as liberators and they're going to love Alexius Angelus showing up, because that's kind of how he presented it to them, that he would be welcomed when he went back home. He wasn't. Instead, there was this pushback, so they had to attack the city. They get into the city. They establish Isaac on the throne and his son Alexius. Long story short, fast forward, Isaac dies, Alexius is emperor, but he's very unpopular. The people don't like this large crusade army standing around. Why are they still standing around there? Because he didn't have all the money. He couldn't deliver all the money that he promised them. So they're waiting around to be paid. There's a coup that happens. Another man comes to the throne. He takes the name Alexius, but he's now Alexius IV. He then kills Alexius III, Prince Alexius. And, now the Crusaders are like, well, the dude who promised us money is dead. So some of the rank and file are like, okay, great. We can finally leave Constantinople and go to Jerusalem. That's where we're supposed to go. But the Crusade rulers, the leaders rather, wanted their money. And so they said, no, this isn't good. We're going to sack the city. So they go in, they sack the city and establish this Latin, kingdom or Latin empire of Jerusalem, of Constantinople rather. And it's a huge mess, right? They're excommunicated throughout this whole process. They're technically then not really Crusaders. The Pope had told them multiple times not to do it. They did it anyways, and it creates this huge, huge mess. And it continues to further separate, right, East and West, so that now you still have, Easterners, as you mentioned, Anthony, right? Byzantines, in particular, Eastern Orthodox, were very upset about this event. And so much so that when John Paul II, for example, went to Athens in 2001, there were Byzantine Eastern Orthodox monks who lined the route of the papal mobile, and they were holding up signs saying 1204, which was when the sack of Constantinople happened, right? So it's one of those events in history where it's just a comedy of errors, a whole series of things that happened that shouldn't have happened but did happen, and led to this horrible event that still impacts.
So a bunch of Greeks made promises they couldn't keep to a bunch of Italians, and we all suffer because of it.
The moral of the story I learned is never trust an Italian business deal.
All right, there's a couple of things, because first off, we have to get you on to discuss the Inquisition. We have to get you on to discuss the Reformation. We have to get you back on just to go through church history. We're going to have to do another episode. Our friend Joseph Diodati would like to know, are there any good movies on the Crusades where it actually portrays it from a Christian perspective and not that we're the villains?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
I don't think so, unfortunately.
But yeah, most major Hollywood productions, have not been kind, or at least I shouldn't say, haven't been historically accurate to this subject, right? I mean, the last one in 2005 was Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven, which is
horrible for historical accuracy.
It's horrible history, and it's not even a good movie, really, frankly. I mean, Liam Neeson is one of the characters. He dies in the first 15 minutes, and the film really goes.
And then Legolas is in there for some reason.
Yeah, Legolas is in there, and just not.
And what's amusing is that there's a lot of Gen Z Catholic guys who are making. I don't know if you know what these are, but they're called based edits. They're basically short video clips of Crusaders, and they're usually taking imagery from this movie. And I'm always kind of exactly like the thumbnail, and I'm kind of chuckling to myself as a Crusader nerd. I'm like, this movie of probably all
Well, the
Crusader
movie's
movies.
awful, but if they could take a short edit that looks like something good, I'm okay with that, you know?
Oh no, I know, but I'm just like, I mean, sometimes you see the edit, you're like, wow, interesting. It's like Godfrey is somehow at the time of the fall of the city of Jerusalem, like 100 plus years later, and he has this illegitimate son, which doesn't sound like Duke Godfrey, and yeah, all kinds of weird
Yeah,
stuff.
there's a lot of historical accuracy. I mean, I actually have my students who take my class on the Crusades at the grad school here at Christendom. I have them. That's one of the topics they can write on, is to do a historical analysis of Kingdom of Heaven and tell me what's wrong with it. And usually, I have to tell them they have to limit they have to really focus on certain aspects, not every historical inaccuracy, because it would be a dissertation, not a paper. If you would, you know, there's one mini series that came out years ago called. I think it's Arn. I think Arn Knights
Oh
Templar.
yeah.
Yeah. So that's, I think it was, I could be wrong, but I think it's Swedish.
It's
And
multilingual. It's
yeah,
multilingual.
it tells,
Swedish
I
is
think it's
the
Swedish or
origin.
Finnish, maybe I think it's Swedish more than Finnish, but it tells the story of Arn, you know, who's a Knight Templar during the period of time, you know, I think maybe in the probably 13th century is when it's roughly, or late 12th century when they're doing it. But it's a multi-part series. It's actually, when I viewed it, I thought it was pretty well done. I think it showed a very historical, you know, again, it's not rooted in any kind of historical accuracy in terms of telling you exactly this is what happened when. A lot of it's dramatized, and that's fine, you know, if it's for the purpose of a story. But I thought it did a good job of presenting and portraying the world, the medieval world, and the complex nature of the medieval world, and how, you know, you had good people, bad people, you had people who have great faith and people who didn't, and people who should have had great faith. But it portrayed even, you know, activity in the Holy Land, I thought, from a more accurate perspective than anything else I had seen. So not perfect, but
Yeah.
a very good representation overall, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I thought that, yeah, Arn's Knights Templar was pretty good. Kingdom of Heaven, in comparison, was definitely a pale, particularly how they portray. I would just say that the basics of kind of like Christian versus Muslim, and again, this was like this was 2005, so there's a lot of liberal backlash to the war in Iraq and stuff like that. And so making Salah ad-Din this kind of like very pious, noble person who just kind of let everyone out of the city at the end, when
Oh, come
a
on.
basic
That's
Wikipedia
insane.
search can tell you, yeah, no, it's more like he sold a ton of them into slavery and made them pay their way out and things along that nature. But, you know, that's not PC in 2005.
Yeah.
So
Jonathan Riley Smith, the Crusade historian I mentioned here, called that film Osama bin Laden's version of history.
dang, I've never heard that. Wow.
I'll
That's
tell you
interesting.
what, like when we spoke with Tom Holland, the historian, and he told us how shocked he was when he visited the Islamic world and he saw Christians being crucified. And it like shook him to his core, to the point where he actually wrote the book Dominion, which explains like the you know the rise of the of Christianity. But just people really have this idea of Islam as if they're just another religion, and they don't realize how brutal Islam really is, and that if you're in that part of the world even today, if you are not one of them, you will be treated as a slave. And if you're a woman, you'll be sold into sex slavery, and if you're a man, you'll be crucified like it's nothing.
Yeah, it's, most people don't understand, you know, basic Islamic doctrine of, you know, understanding the world in two different camps, right? There's the House of Islam, the Dar al-Islam, and there's the Dar al-Harab, the House of War. So that's the kind of the, you know, the devout Islamic understanding of the world, and it's you're either in the House of Islam, so you're a part of the Ummah, the community of believers, or you're not. And if you're not, you're in this house of war,
Yeah.
right? And so there's supposed to be this jihad, this constant kind of warfare between the two houses to bring those who are not in the House of Islam into it. And that's something that's overlooked. And that's not to say that, you know, there aren't. That's obviously a very devout and you know, kind of pure, if you will, understanding of Islam and the doctrines. And it's not to say that there aren't secular, you know, Muslim nations around the world that act geopolitically different from that, but that is the teaching. That is the teaching. So yeah.
We're going to have to get you on to discuss the real story of Catholic history, because a lot of people don't realize, anytime you watch anything about European history, like European history and Catholic history can't be separated. They are one and the same. That European history is church history if seen properly, you know. And we get all these different movies about the Middle Ages, and none of them ever have a proper historical context of taking Catholicism in, you know, in its proper place. So one quick thing, somebody else asked, Sherry Sweeney asked, did Saint Bernard regret preaching the Second Crusade? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, so no, Saint Bernard never really expressed any regret about preaching the Second Crusade. He did express regret on how the Second Crusade ended, because it did not accomplish what it set out to do. It set out to liberate, or re-liberate, if you will, the city of Edessa, which had been, so that was the first Crusader state that had been established at the end of the First Crusade. And it was then conquered, if you will, by Zengi, a Muslim ruler at the time in the area. And so the Second Crusade was launched to re-liberate that city. But it was a large German army under the king of the Germans, Conrad III, and large French army by King Louis VII. Went to the Holy Land, but both met in great disaster, and it ultimately ended up never getting to Edessa. You know, some remnants of both armies met in Damascus, along with some local Christians at the time, and tried to take the city of Damascus, but that siege lasted, a couple of days. Didn't last very long, and was just an abject, absolute disaster. And it was actually kind of a shock to people in Europe that it didn't succeed, because the First Crusade had been so successful, and there had been so many areas, as I mentioned earlier, of divine intervention, if you will, to ensure, at least that's how they saw it, right, to ensure that the First Crusade succeeded. And so people kind of expected, well, this was always going to be the case. And then when it didn't happen, there was a lot of soul searching. And another crusade wasn't called for a generation, for 40 years, because the disaster of the Second Crusade was so heartfelt. And St. Bernard then regretted that. He thought that partially his own sinfulness, if you can imagine, right, was to blame for the failure of the Second Crusade. And so he took a very greater penitential look at his own life, and furthered even more the sacrifices and penances that he undertook anyways, and as a result of that.
We need to recapture that in our modern world.
Yeah, fasting and prayer and sacrifice, because I wasn't faithful enough, or my preaching wasn't effective enough, or the troops didn't act as a Christian enough manner, if you will. And that had direct result on why they failed. I mean, that's what they believed, and so he acted in accordance with that belief, in the hopes that his faithfulness would bring something greater from it. So,
you're a convert, Steve, or you're a cradle Catholic?
Well, it's a hard. So, without getting into too much detail, I mean, I wasn't baptized Catholic, but I was baptized Anglican, actually, but ultimately came into the Catholic Church as a child, so as a young man, or even before that, really, even before I was around the age of reason. So
I could talk to you for 5 hours. I could ask your conversion story. I could get into you about all these different things. Do you have any of because you teach at Christendom College, right?
I do, yeah, the grad
school. Do you have any
online
courses? Do you have anything up online that we could go and watch, or?
Yeah, so well, not necessarily through Christendom. So I mean, I do offer my courses online, and they're live streams. You can audit the course. It's a small fee to be able to audit. If you're a catechist, we have at your parish or whatever, we do have a catechist discount, if you will. So I teach, my course is coming up in the fall here, Church History 1. So I teach 2 courses, Church History 1, Church History 2. Church History 1, I go from Pentecost to 1300, so the time of King St. Louis IX. And then Church History 2 is the follow-on of that course. And then occasionally I teach an elective course on the Crusades itself. So those are, if you can either take that with me, or you can take it asynchronously. So all those courses are recorded, and you can watch them, these lectures, at your leisure. I do, if people are interested, I do offer apologetics courses on church history through Catholic Answers. So they have their School of Apologetics, which is an online school. And I recorded 2 mini courses, if you will, obviously very summarized down version of what I teach at the grad school, and obviously for a more wider and popular audience, not an academic audience, through that platform as well. So
I think church history is probably the most powerful apologetic we have. If you really understand how much Christianity, and the Catholic Church specifically, transformed the pagan world, it is such a, to see how the world lives under pagan practices versus how the church develops law. I mean, just people think we see modern law and you just assume that it's been like this since the days of the Greeks and the Romans. No, it was canon lawyers in the church hammering out these things and really seeing how the West was formed through the church is such a powerful apologetic. I think it's something we don't access enough and talk about enough.
No, I agree. I think, we've done a good job, I think, over the last number of years of coming up with, courses on scripture and, courses on the catechism and focusing on those areas to educate Catholics, which is, of course, massively necessary. But one area that hasn't been as focused is church history. And I've tried to, that's where my work has been. And, through Ascension Press, I came out with Epic Journey Through Church History a couple of years ago, which is a parish-based catechetical effort to try to accomplish some of that. So that's been my work. But yeah, I'd love to come back on the show and talk general church history topics.
Oh, that would be awesome. What's the book you want to push the most tonight? So Glory of the Crusades is what we discussed tonight. So if you guys want to do a crash course in the Crusades, the Glory of the Crusades is what we talked about tonight. What's the most recent book, though? The Real Story of Catholic History, Answering 20 Centuries of Anti-Catholic Myths?
No, that's one that came out just a couple years after Glory of the Crusades. So my most recent one is called Light from Darkness. 9 times the Catholic Church was in turmoil, but came out stronger than before. And so that's where I look at 9 different times in church history where there was a period of great crisis in the church and how that great crisis led then to an authentic reform or renewal of the church later. And so each chapter presents the crisis and then presents the reform and the renewal that occurred as a result of it. And then I finish with a historical case study on how as Catholics we can act, how we should act and how we should not act in a time of crisis in the church, where I look at the lives of St. Catherine of Siena, who gives us a great example of how to live and how to act during a time of church crisis, and then the life of Savonarola, the Dominican monk in Florence in the 15th century, who did not give us a good example.
I kind of like Savonarola, so I'm just...
there's some things about Savonarola, there's other things that are not so great.
But I have to be honest, I like Pope Alexander VI too, so I don't know if you want to take
the Borgia Pope. Yeah, that's a whole other topic.
I think he gets a bad rap. I'm
just
saying.
But so that's the most recent book, and I just actually finished my draft manuscript on my latest book, which hopefully will come out next year, on Catholic scapegoats, where I look at the lives of individual Catholics who have been scapegoated by enemies of the church through history, and present the real story of who they are. So people like Marie Antoinette, Columbus, Cortez, Guy Fawkes, and people like that. So
okay, sweet. So here's what we're gonna do. When does that come out?
Hopefully 2025, probably. I mean,
okay, so you got to. All right. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna try when we get off, because this one we even had to book a month or 2 out. So when we get off, check your schedule, and even if it's a few months out, just tell me a date that you have, and we'll do another one of these, and we'll do church history. And then when your new book comes out, we'd love to get you back on to discuss your new book.
Perfect. Sounds great. Appreciate it,
Steve. Thank you so much for coming on, man. This is such a great, informative episode. I'm pretty sure our audience loved it, and we're hoping we could shed some light on some of the nonsense out in the world, man.
Great. I appreciate it. Thank you, guys. God bless everyone. Appreciate it.
Anytime. Absolutely. All right. We will see you guys on Thursday's going to be Nick and myself. We have Eric Ibarra coming on. So we will see you guys on Thursday.
Let's go.